Far away from the heartlands of Islam, Muslims in South and Southeast Asia make up nearly 2/3 of the global Muslim population. The emergence of the religion was in the early era of Islam, but no one could have predicted the explosive effect it would have. Asia Wired looks at the seeds, the growth and the blossoming of Islam, which has defined the region as we see it today. Speaking to its experts on the Muslim heritage of this culturally rich part of the world. In this episode, we look at Bangladesh, one of the smallest but largest Muslim populated countries in the world, with over 130 million followers. Called the playground of seasons because it has 6, not 4 seasons, the country lies on the world's largest river delta, the Ganges Brahmaputra. Formerly East Pakistan, the nation was formed after a painful 9-month-long independence war in 1971. Memories still fresh and raw till today. The country composes of a history weaved with Hindu, Buddhist and Islamic influences stretching centuries. We spoke to Muhammad Majnun Khan, an award-winning Bengali writer, literary critic and researcher in Islamic thought and history. He is the author of The Muslim Heritage of Bengal, a book covering 800 years of the history of Islam in Bengal through the example of 42 inspirational figures. Thank you, Muhammad Majnun Khan, for joining Asia Wired on Islam Channel. For many Bengalis, the history of Islam in Bangladesh is quite an unknown subject. For many, it doesn't go beyond figures such as the great Shah Jalal and his companions to the spread of the religion. Could you explain some of the reasons for this and also begin to sketch for us how Islam began to take hold in Bangladesh?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Let's define first what we mean by Bengal before answering the question. Arabic, Bangala, Persian, Bengal, Sanskrit, Vanga, and Bengali, Bangla, and in English we call Bengal. That region has a number of definitions, both linguistic, political, as well as cultural definitions. And at one time, the good part of northeast of India good part of that area was known as the province of Bengal. Now, that included the present-day Bangladesh, the Indian state of West Bengal, Bihar, Malda, Assam and other regions, and provinces and districts. I think for our purpose here, we're predominantly talking about Bangladesh and the Indian state of West Bengal. Now, going back to your question, how Islam actually reached that area. It's a fascinating story. And you're right, the young generation, those of Bangladeshi origin in the Western countries, particularly in the United Kingdom and Europe and the United States, they're disconnected from that history. A number of reasons, because of lack of suitable information, readable information, accessible information on the subject in English. Other reasons are because these young generation, the diaspora communities, don't often have access to the languages I was talking about. They won't have access to Bengali, probably spoken only, but not literary Bengali. So they won't be able to access the literature in that subject. Certainly, most of them will struggle with Urdu, Persian, Farsi, and Arabic. And without some understanding of these languages, it's very difficult to understand the history of Islam in those regions. And my task was to provide an accessible information to the younger generation in the Western countries, but also in the subcontinent, in a language that made sense to them and in a format that's easily readable, which is what my book, The Muslim Heritage of Bengal, seeks to achieve. Now, moving forward to the history bit. As we all know, Islam was promulgated by the Prophet in Arabia in the 7th century. Within 50 years of his death, Muslims went in the west to the coasts of Atlantic. Simultaneously, Muslims were moving towards the east. They had entered the borders of India and reached the Indus Valley. And that momentous year is 711. And in the north, Muslims had moved up in Central Asia and pushing further into Uzbekistan and Georgia and other places. So this was a unique event in human history, that simultaneous movements in the east, west, and the north. Now, we're going to be obviously focusing here towards the east. Muhammad bin Qasim moved into Multan and Sindh region and established Muslim settlements in that area. Subsequently, and these are very brief comments, and understandably because of lack of time. Subsequently, you had Arab rulers ruled these places during the Abbasid times, and what was happening in the subcontinent was Muslims kept on pushing further in, eventually reached Delhi, which became the Delhi Sultanate was established there. And we're looking at here a period of massive expansion. At that time, Bengal was being ruled by a dynasty called the Palas, the Pala dynasty. What you would call a Pala Shamrajyo. They were ruling Bengal at that time. They were Buddhist rulers. Some of them were very wise and very, what Plato would say, philosopher kings. Dharmapala was one of them, very actively promoted Bengali language and literature. And Bengal was predominantly Buddhist at that time. I'm talking about here, the year in which the Palas were established was year 750. Very interesting year, because it was the same year in which the Abbasids came to power in what is today known as Baghdad, after ousting the Umayyads. So you see what was happening in Bengal at that time. The Palas were in position, they were ruling, and they ruled for centuries. Particularly, I wanted to highlight their contribution to Bengali literature and Bengali language. They preserved that and contributed to its dissemination. They ruled for several centuries until the 11th century, when you had the Palas were weakening, and you had rulers, merchants, travelers from the south emerged in Bengal, and they ousted the Palas and established what is known in Bengali as Shen Shamrajyo, which is the Shen dynasty. Shens were Hindu rulers from the south, and they ousted the Palas, established themselves, and they ruled for over a century. They weren't particularly keen on the Buddhists, because they wanted to establish their own creed and own beliefs and practices. The Shenas were less tolerant and less pluralistic compared to the Palas. But during the Shena period, you had a lot of forced conversion from Buddhism into Hinduism, also at Bengal at that time. until the early part of the 13th century. By that time, you already had a Delhi Sultanate well established in what is today known as New Delhi, and the ruler in there at that time was Sultan Qutbuddin Aybak. Qutbuddin Aybak was of Turkish Afghan extraction, and he was keen to expand his dominions. He found a general and nominated him to take things forward. His name was Ikhtiyaruddin Muhammad Bakhtiyar Khilji. Bakhtiyar Khilji was also of Afghan Turkic extraction from the Khilaj tribe in Afghanistan. Very short man with long arms. He was recruited into his army, Qutbuddin's army, proved to be very successful, and then he was commissioned with some work. So go on, move towards the east if you can. He moved rather quickly. We are told by the classical historian of Muslim Bengal, by Shams Siraj, that in his Tabaqat-e-Nasiri he provides an account, very brief account of how Bakhtiyar Khilji marched into places like Bihar and surrounding areas with Gore and other places with a handful of horsemen, faced very little resistance. Why? Because the local population were actually suffering under the existing rulers and they wanted liberation. And they cooperated with this new hero, so to speak, who marched in. As long as he was going to be anything better than what they had at the time, they'd be too happy to welcome him, and that's exactly what happened. He pretty quickly expanded his dominions, settled in what is today now North Bangladesh, a place called Devkot at that time. He was an ambition man. He was not going to sit around and do nothing. He planned the next big expedition. From North Bengal, he wanted to go to Tibet. He set with an army there, wasn't aware of the terrain, found massive problems and resistance, returned back demoralized and died eventually. But he is the founder of, if you like, Muslim rule in Bengal. His successors continued ruling for several decades after him, and then you had phases of Muslim rule in Bengal, and two main phases would be the Sultanate period, which was initiated by Bakhtiyar Khilji, beginning of the 13th century. We're looking at 1204. That persisted and continued with ups and downs, successors and setbacks for several centuries until the Mughals appeared on the scene in 1576 under Akbar the Great. So you're looking at from the beginning of the 13th century towards the latter part of the 16th century. This period is known as the Sultanate period in Bengal. Fascinating period for a whole range of reasons. Politically, massive expansion. The rulers were very pluralistic, tolerant, so they did not force anybody to change their religions at all. So Hindus remained Hindus, Buddhists remained Buddhists, and Muslims remained Muslims. And a lot of their officials in the administrations reflected that diversity. These rulers were very, very tolerant. But one thing that needs to be highlighted is their patronage of Bengali language and literature during the Sultanate period. Was these rulers have to be credited for saving Bengali language from extinction. They not only actively promoted learning and research and scholarship in Bengali language and literature. They actually got some of the most classical Indian literature to be translated also into Bengali for the first time. Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and the many other classical texts of which were at that time in Sanskrit. And because the Sanskrit was the language of scholarship within Hinduism, so these literature was restricted to the elites. But these rulers, by patronizing and paying translators to get them into colloquial languages, particularly Bengali, made that literature, for the first time in the history of the subcontinent, accessible to the masses. And that is an important contribution which is not often credited to these rulers. But on the other side, what they did was actively promoted Islamic scholarship and research and writing. So you like scholars like Nur Qutb-e-Alam, you had Shah Muhammad Saghir, and many others were for the first time writing works of Islamic literature, books, poetry, and other things on Islamic themes and topics in Bengali, colloquial Bengali, even if they were using Arabic or Persian scripts at times. So this cultural history is quite unique. And bearing in mind, we're talking about Islam finding its own feet in an ocean of Hinduism and Buddhism at that time. The presence of Muslims, with Bangladesh being the third largest Muslim country in the world at the moment, population-wise, this is a miracle in the history of Islam, that you have so many people in a Buddhist and Hindu ocean who are Muslims, and no major armies came from Arabia or Persia to go and convert anybody by force there. You had Bakhtiyar Khilji and his successors. And as I said earlier, these guys marched in there with, according to Minhaj Siraj, they marched in to Bengal with a handful of horsemen. And the locals probably thought these are traders from Persia or Arabia. So it wasn't a huge army that came here. To find yourself with the third largest population-wise Muslim country in the world, in Bangladesh now, it's a mighty miracle in the history of Islam. Now,
so very quickly, so of course, political rule had a massive influence in bringing Islam to the region. What about the influence of, for example, figures such as Shah Jalal, who's very famous amongst the Bengali community, and other figures, such as companions? What influence did they have?
Massive. If you look at how Islam moved into Bengali incrementally, I mentioned the political dimension. You had a whole group of preachers and traders came along at the same time. Because in fact, centuries before Bakhtiyar Khilji, you could find local Muslim communities embedded across subcontinent, including Bengal. How did that happen? Because of traders from Persia, Arabia coming to trade, and they would bring their culture and language and their faith with them, and they were marrying locally and settling there. Naturally, they had assimilated with the local communities, and Shah Jalal is a Moinuddin Chishti, Ajmeri, and many others in the history. Dada Ganj Bakhsh, Abul Hasan Ali al-Hujwuri, better also known as, these luminaries came and they preached. These guys were Sufis, but also Islamic scholars who came and brought people together through their peaceful preaching. You had Buddhists, Hindus, Sikhs, animists. People were coming, all different faiths and cultures, flocking to these people. Because all they were coming with was peace, which is what the Arabic word Islam means. And a Muslim, the word Muslim means the one who's in a state of peace. And they were living their faith and showing people that you can live in peace. and naturally people flocked to them. So they played a massive role. The traders played a massive role. Along with the political dimension, you could see there was 3, 4, 5 different ways Islam had spread into these places. I'll give you an example. How did coins issued by Abbasid Caliphs end up in Paharpur, in Rajshahi, issued during the time of Harun al-Rashid, Muntasir Billah? These coins were discovered in Comilla and in Paharpur, Rajshahi and Comilla and other places in Bangladesh. How did they get there? Traders were bringing these coins dated back to the 9th century to Bengal and other parts of the subcontinent. So you can see the whole range of ways Islam had spread into the not only subcontinent as a whole, but Bengal as well.
So who was the biggest catalyst?
I would say a combination between the preachers and the traders who paved the way initially, and then the political and military forces came and consolidated things. So it's like saying you can only get a coin with a head and a tail, and same here. You had the early preachers and traders came first and pioneered the way, followed by the influx of the political and military rulers who established themselves in those lands and ruled, some successfully, others not so. Which is why you see after the Mughals established themselves towards the end of the 16th century, they took control of Bengal. For the Mughals, Bengal was a love-hate relationship. It was a frontier province, so far away from their headquarters, they struggled to maintain it. But Bengal was a very wealthy and rich province, so they couldn't let go of it either, which is why you've got Jahangir, you've got Shah Jahan, and their successors always sent a prominent member of their family as the governor of Bengal. Usually a royal prince would be the governor, because they knew Bengal was economically very important to them, even though politically it was so far away from the center. The Mughals played a critical role, particularly in the architecture and literary side, bearing in mind during both the Sultanate and Mughal period, the language of administration in Bengal and much of the rest of the subcontinent was Persian, Farsi. It was only during the British period, in 1837, that Persian was abolished and replaced with English. So from the beginning of the 13th century to 1837, during those centuries, the main language of administration and scholarship in Bengal and much of the subcontinent was Persian, Farsi, which is why which is why you see the classical textbooks on the history of that region. Most of them are in Persian. You get an odd book in Arabic, and more recently, certainly post-British period, you had more in English and Bengali, but certainly during both Sultanate period as well as the Mughal period, the language was of scholarship and administration was Persian. So both Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists would, in addition to learning Sanskrit or Arabic, they would be learning Persian. Because if you wanted to serve in the administration, become a judge, military officer, or any other capacity in the government, a civil servant or anything else, you needed that language.
So now you mentioned the change from Persian as the official language to English. So now, of course, we'll go to the next period, which had a massive impact on Bangladesh, which we still feel today. Could you explain how the British took over Bengal, their impact on the region, and of course the eventual fight for independence.
Right. Well, the British period was like the other periods. They weren't particularly planned. The British did not go from Great Britain or from United Kingdom, say we're going to go and get Bengal. It started very much like the Sultanate period, and before them, traders went there first. We had East India Company started trading. In headquarters was in Kolkata, and they established themselves, embedded themselves from Kolkata and spread rest of the subcontinent. I mean, the East India Company at its height was the Microsoft of its day. It was a massive corporation with its headquarters in Kolkata. It actually spread massively, and as it did so, it naturally got in a tussle with the rulers. Bearing in mind, after the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, the Mughals started losing their grip on things. Bengal being so far distant from the center meant you had people like Murshid Kulli Khan, Alivardi Khan. They became known as the independent Nawabs. They were paying lip service to the center but ruling those regions individually. The British companies wanted to expand. They were ambitious. They wanted more land. They wanted more business. They wanted more stakes in all kinds of other sectors of industry in Bengal. What they did, they traded off with these local rulers. I'll have this, you'll have that. I'll have this piece of land, you will have that piece. And we will pension you off to do this, that. And in so doing, rulers did not always pay attention to the long-term interest, their own interest and the interest of their people. That's the reality. You can't run away from it. And the East India Company was looking at things purely and simply, and I can understand why they were doing this, on a commercial basis. You are aware there is a road called Commercial Road in East London. This road was established so commerce can come into the city of London straight from Bengal through the docks. Again, so the British period was very important for not only for political reasons but economic reasons. After the mutiny, formal British rule was established in India. The last of the Mughals, Bahadur Shah Zafar, he was exiled, and basically British rule in that region continued until the establishment of two states in British India. Basically, the independent state of India and the independent state of what officially known as the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. So the British legacy, if you like, these two countries are the British legacy of British rule in the subcontinent. Historians, particularly Indian and Pakistani historians, are critical of British aspects of British rule in the subcontinent, and a lot of their arguments are valid. But they were also positive things, particularly the promotion of English language, scholarship, preservation of historical things and records. The British rule, during the British rule, that played a big, massive role in preserving those heritages. And so I think we need a balanced approach if we're going to assess the achievements and failures during British rule in the subcontinent. The same I would argue, the same point is also true of the history of Bangladesh during the Pakistan period. because from 1947 to 1971, Bangladesh was known as East Pakistan. By that time, Bengal had already split again. West Bengal went to India, and East Bengal became known as East Pakistan. A lot of positives and achievements took place during the Pakistan period. Again, a lot of Bengali nationalist historians don't want to acknowledge that for ideological reasons. I give you a quick example. You look at a Rajshahi University, Chittagong University, some of the most well-known institutions in Bangladesh, such as Bangla Academy, a Islamic Foundation Bangladesh. The foundation of a lot of these institutions were laid in Bangladesh during the Pakistan period. So everything was not doom and gloom during the Pakistan period. But Pakistan period is also known for giving birth to Bengali nationalism. Because during that period you had arguments that were formulated based on grievances, that West Pakistanis were benefiting politically, economically, and in other ways more than the East Pakistanis. That argument is only partially valid, because a lot of progress was being made in East Pakistan, but not to the extent that it should have. That is true. On the other hand, to argue that the East Pakistanis were being literally robbed at daylight by the West Pakistanis is factually inaccurate. So again, there is a need for objectivity in the assessment of the Pakistan period. And the arguments of Bengali nationalism was, no, we need a Bengali nation. That Muslim nationalism has not worked. We need a new nationalism based on language.
So he undoubtedly affected the religion in terms of the key concept of unity, in a sense.
Partly, because even after the establishment of Bangladesh, the people of Bangladesh have remained Muslims. So it has not necessarily undermined the religion as such. What it has done is undermined, you can argue, Muslim unity. Yes, that would be a valid argument. The problem with the nationalists was their arguments was partially based on facts and partially concocted based on a made up economic figures that had no basis. So the reality was different from what was being projected to the people in East Pakistan. And as you know, illiteracy was very high. The masses were whipped up by influential leaders and they went for it. They were promised a Sonar Bangla, Golden Bengal. But as we know, and to move on to the post 1971 period, as we know, that Sonar Bangla remains a dream unfulfilled to this day. After the establishment of Bangladesh in 1971, all the big promises, most of them have been betrayed repeatedly by rulers from all different parties, all different shades and colors. The reality is in 1971, there was handful of slums in Bangladesh. Handful of slums, bastis. Today we have more than 10,000 of them. That's the reality. It is true that post-independent Bangladesh has made tremendous economic strides. Textiles, agriculture, infrastructure, reduction in child mortality, huge steps in this direction, no doubt about it, because you can't argue against facts. By the same token, you've had massive rise in the concentration of resources in fewer hands, which means the Shunar Bangla only applies to probably the 1% elite. For the rest of them, it's a betrayal. Law and order is a nightmare. By all accounts, according to independent observers, Bangladesh is currently a police state. So the reality is, 71 happened because two brothers fought each other and did not communicate, and outsiders interfered and made sure that there was a permanent divorce. It is sad, but we are where we are, and Bangladesh can only move forward by learning from its past. It has a huge and impressive past, and I allude to this past in Muslim Heritage of Bengal book.
So what are these lessons?
Bangladesh has huge potential. Human resources, economic, the talent is there, and educationally it can make massive progress, but it's not doing so. Stuck. Nearly 50% of the population is illiterate. That is a crime. So a lot of investment needs to be put into education, healthcare, and other things. The lessons are from the past. The lessons are from the past, that this country, it needs to be a pluralistic country, open, democratic, not democratic in name, in practice. Institutions need to be democratized. You need right people in positions of power and decision-making level, and you need wealth to be redistributed, as it has been done in the history of Bengal before. So there is political lessons to be learned from the past, cultural lessons, where both Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and others lived, Christians all lived together in Bengal without fighting and shedding blood. This is a massive lesson for not only Bangladesh going forward, but for India as a whole. Now, same for Pakistan. But also there is lessons to be learned about intellectual contributions. Pioneering scholars who specialized in Arabic, in Persian, in Bengali, in Urdu, and other languages, published pioneering works on Islamic thought, literature, and philosophy, and linguistics. If we do not remember these pioneers, who are going to be role model for the new generation of Bangladeshis in Bangladesh and in the diaspora? This is why I bring out 42 role models in my book, to serve as an inspiration for the younger generation. Going forward, you also need to look at how the country lives with its differences, because there is massive differences and disagreements based on nationalism, and our understanding of nationalism needs to be re-examined again. Whether it is Muslim nationalism, whether it is secular nationalism, whether it is a linguistic nationalism, if we turn those nationalisms into a mini God, they do not serve the nation for which they are meant to serve. They cause more havoc, and that needs rethinking, because nationalism was invented in Europe to avoid Europeans killing each other. So we created in Europe boundaries, national boundaries, nation states, so that the French can stay within their boundaries, the British could stay within their boundaries, the Spanish could stay within their boundaries, the Italians could stay in their boundaries. It served a useful purpose in Europe. Transplanting that into the subcontinental psyche and mind frame, and using that and causing havoc, is counterproductive and is not going to serve neither Hindus, nor Muslims, nor Buddhists, or Sikhs, or any other people of any faith, or non-faith, no faith in the subcontinent. We need to move beyond nationalisms.
And learn from the Muslim heritage of Bengal?
Indeed, because the perception is it was a dark period. Far from it. It was one of the most enlightened periods in the history of Bengal during the Muslim rule, 1,000 years. And we don't know about it enough. Historians don't research this anymore, and young generation don't know about this heritage. What we need to do is more people need to take more interest in this area, learn lessons from it, benefit from it, and allow that period to serve as inspiration for the present and future generation. And I hope that my book will inspire people to do just that.
Thank you, Muhammad Majnun Khan, for joining Asia Wide on Islam Channel. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum to all of you.